Welcome, welcome everyone. We are here with Iya Affo, who I have just discovered over the last couple of months and have been excited about this interview forthcoming because she's been on the road quite a bit. So it's taken a little bit to get this interview lined up, but we're super excited to have you here, Sunshine. So welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad we're finally able to connect.
Same here, same here. So for those of you who are new to your work, I'd like to just read a little bit background about you so they get familiar with who you are. Iya Affo is the founder of Heal Historical Trauma. As a descendant of spiritual and physical healers, Iya's life is centered around spirituality, indigenous healing, and wellness. Her ancestors hail from the sacred city of 41 mountains in West Africa, Barbados, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. Talk about exotic background. She developed an interest in neuroscience and later studied nutrition, massage therapy, and chiropractor care, while also using and learning those indigenous practices that we just spoke of. Today, she is a culturalist and a historical trauma specialist and coach, and a certified adverse childhood experiences trainer, among other things, which we'll talk about today in our interview. She has spent an extended time living and studying in Native American, Yoruba, Buddhist, Hindu, and Taoist traditions around the world and has found a home among the indigenous people of North America. She writes about trauma and healing on the Paces Connection platform and is an advocate for people who have been disempowered. Wow, such an incredible background. So we're super excited to dive in.
Nice. Thank you so much.
So before we get started with your current work, I'd love to rewind the clock and go back to early days because you write about healing and care that you learned from your mother at a really early age. What can you tell us about those childhood memories and what you learned about trauma from that early chapter in your life?
I had such an interesting upbringing because although I am a Black woman, an African woman living in America, my mother was heavily tied to the Buddhist tradition. My grandmother, who passed away before I was born, had Buddhas in her house as my mother was growing up. So, my mother's almost 80. So this, Black woman growing up in a home with Buddhas in the house, and still having this strong attachment to the West Indian ways of being. So her family comes from the Barbados and the Bahamas, but originally from Benin Republic, West Africa, prior to the slave trade. So there's a lot of just diversity happening. And she was just an interesting woman because very much a healer, very much in alignment with our ancestors, the people that came before us. But what she did was she took physical therapy. She was a doctor of physical therapy. She took physical therapy and combined it with all of these alternative treatments. So like you would go into her practice and she'd have crystals under the table where she was doing her physical therapy work. She got trained in acupuncture. She spent time training really all over the world, learning about alternative healing. And it's funny because my earliest memories, and people go back to, oh, I had this memory in childhood, my favorite childhood memory was on Sundays, and I was in kindergarten. And on Sundays, my mother was working on another doctorate. We would be at the Columbia University rat lab, where she would be running experiments on rats. And so we would be dissecting rats and we would do things to alter their brain. And then we would put them on this bar and they would run across, and I'd be there with the stopwatch timing after we, did certain things with the brain, how long it took the rat to get to the other side. And this was my life. And the other pieces, which when I think about it now, like sometimes I tell these stories and it sounds so crazy because we're in 2023 when these things couldn't happen, right? But She also worked in a nursing home for a long period of time with geriatric patients, doing geriatric care. And I would go with her. So imagine, like, I'm too young to even go upstairs in the nursing home. So they wouldn't allow me, if I needed to go upstairs and see patients because I was too little. But I was able to follow her around. And what she ended up having me do was, at that time, there were a lot of amputees, and she would have me take the remaining limb, put it in paraffin wax, take it out of the wax, pull take the wax off, and then massage the remaining limbs. I had to be 6, 7, 8 years old. And this was the work I was doing. And I loved it. I didn't care that the limb was, I didn't care about any of that. I was so happy to be helping people and touching people and just being there for, elderly people. That these are the greatest memories of my life. And really that put me on the road to all the work that I do now.
It's interesting because, getting started so early on, you kind of learn to overcome fear or, any kind of issues that might be conditioned, right? To be
Right.
negative about lost limbs and about aging and all of these things that sometimes we grow up with negative issues around. You didn't have that.
No, I didn't. I always remember having just profound love for human beings. I would get my feelings hurt often, and I experienced a lot of pain in early childhood, but my heart was really loving any and all people. That's just always who I've been.
The other thing is that it really showed you discernment, right? How to overcome those conditioning, how to overcome fear. And I think most importantly is respect for the elderly, which, that's not something that's automatically taught today. So the fact that you had that, as part of that early training is amazing, right? It's something that we can all learn from.
Yeah.
So now I'd like to dive into some of the practices that you studied. North American, Yoruba, Buddhist, Hindu, and Taoist communities. And I've dabbled in all of those myself, right? So I'm pretty familiar with them. Did you learn about trauma from those experiences, or did that come later through your formal studies?
It's funny because I'm going to rewind us back just a bit to really talk about my first foray into trauma. When I went away to the University of Maryland to go to undergraduate school. And prior to going away to college, I had been a horrible teenager. So I had this great relationship with my mother as a young person. And then as I got to be a teenager, I was one of those horrible people. And so when I graduated, I felt very guilty I had put my mother through a lot of just stress and aggravation. And the commitment that I made was that she wouldn't have to pay for my college and that I would have a job and sustain myself through school. So I felt like that was the payback for being so annoying. So I went away to school. I got a full ride academic scholarship. So that part was taken care of. And then there came the part for the job. I was looking for a job on campus, and I came across this fantastic, amazing, wonderful job that I didn't think they were going to hire me to do. But I took my chance, and it was teaching math at the local prison. And I wasn't a math major. I have always been strong in math. I was always interested in math, but, I figured, they're going to want a math major or somebody, that has more math under their belt. Well, it turns out they were like, listen, you're the only idiot that has wanted this job in 3 years. So the job is yours. So, I was like ecstatic. I was scared to tell my mother because I thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be another thing that annoys her to death. Like, you can't be 18 and 19 and going into the local prison to work. So I didn't tell her. I just told her I was teaching math. I go on my first day. I walk in, and they neglected to tell me a few things. And one was that I would be walking through this gauntlet to get to the classroom, number one, because there's people that are, literally in cages on both sides of you as you're walking, and they're yelling out things and calling out things. And I'm a young girl, you know, so it was a little bit intimidating. And then I get to the classroom and it gets even worse because the correction officer does not stay in the classroom with you. You stay there by yourself with 30 to 40 people that are incarcerated. You have an assistant who is also a long-term incarcerated person. And the correction officer comes around every 30 minutes or so and peeps in the window. So here I am with, you know, all of these men. I started to think that, you know, like I could tell what crime they did. I said, oh, he's probably, you know, the drug trade, or that's probably a white collar. But it ended up that they were, you know, very serious crimes. There was a lot of rape and murder and armed robbery, so forth and so on. But what I noticed was when I was looking out at these people, I saw beautiful human beings and just wondered, like, how do we get here? How does this happen that we're here? And I started asking them. I just wanted to know, like, how are we here? What happened? And more, they talked about their mother. My mother left me. My mother was addicted. My mother allowed someone to abuse me. And over, it would be these conversations about mothers. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. Then they started to tell me how they had never done well in math before, and they were really excelling. And I thought, well, I can't be that good in teaching math, but I didn't understand why they were doing so well. But either way, I decided, you know, we're going to work on healing their lives. So I finally had to tell my mother. I called her and I'm like, Mommy, I need to tell you something. So I told her the job because I needed her to order me Louise Hay. And you, with your background, you probably know Louise Hay. Okay.
Of course, yeah.
Yes, you do. Louise Hay had a book called You Can Heal Your Life. And I said, Mommy, could you please order me a case of those books? Because I want to work with my students in that way. And we started to do 30 minutes of math. We would do the assignment, catch up on stuff. I'd give homework. And the rest of the time would be working on You Could Heal Your Life. That was my first foray into understanding adversity in childhood. I didn't know that that was happening. What I learned later on was that they excelled in math because I created safety. In that moment, just like all of the trauma things that we hear now, right? Instead of saying what's wrong with you, we say what's happened to you in this trauma-informed community. So I was doing that at 19. I didn't understand all the stuff later on, but that was essentially what I was. What happened? How did we get here? And how can we heal? And that really was how I got started with trauma. And then I went through a lot of other directions. I went to chiropractic school and I did some other things in massage school and wanted to work a lot of, you know, physical healing because I had grown up so much around that. And then I really found my passion in my home with adverse childhood experiences and historical trauma. And that's really where I found my passion. But we had to come full circle, right? It was like, you know, almost 30 years later, we were full circle and here I am.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that about your history. And, you know, I do have a friend who does, a couple of friends actually, who do volunteer work at local prisons here in Northern California. And they also share some astonishing stories. And I think part of it was that you were an empath, right? So you felt and sensed what they were going through, and you took the time to care enough to ask the right questions, you know, and I think that's another piece of it. You know, I wonder, in looking back, how much part of it was, you know, also that you were a woman too.
Right.
Providing the safety. Yeah.
For sure. And a young woman, right? And a lot of them were doing a lot of time. So, you know, there's all of that. But yeah, and just in that moment, you were safe. I wasn't insulting you. There wasn't chaos. It was calm. You were safe, and you got to talk about yourself and have somebody understand how you made the mistakes that you made in your life.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised they didn't bring up their fathers, because a lot of men also have
The father stuff.
the father stuff going on. So
Yes,
interesting.
yes, yes.
Well, so let's dive into, so that was kind of the beginning of your trauma experience. And then at some point you went into Indigenous communities. Before we get back to the North American Indigenous communities, I'd love to hear how, certainly Yoruba from your African past makes total sense.
Right.
But the Hindu and the Taoist communities, talk about that a little bit.
Girl. Well, luckily it's you, right? Because I know that you're going to understand me when I tell you this, because it's going to sound so ridiculous to a lot of people. Every year for 5 years, I would do a 41-day water fast, because in my African tradition, 41 is a sacred number, right? So in Christianity, I know 40 is a number, but for us, 41 is a sacred number. So I would do this 41-day water fast. I did it one year, and it always moved obstacles or evolved me in some type of way after the 41 days was over. And this particular time, I did the 41 days, and suddenly I had this just affinity toward India. It was always on my list. It was always kind of in my world, but it wasn't like I need to go to India, right? It was kind of like, oh yeah, one day maybe I'll do this. I started to have this affinity. My friend got a cat. She named it India. And I'm thinking like, wow, that's wild. India's been on my mind. I'm craving Indian food. I'm just dreaming of India. One night, I was on my way to sleep. And you know how you have that space between you're not awake, but you're also not asleep, right? So I was in that space. I saw a scroll open up, and an Indian woman's face was on the scroll. And I was looking, and I said, but how will I know you when I see you? I don't know why I said that, but that's what I said. The scroll got bigger. It went away. I woke up in the morning, and I had remembered that it happened. And I thought, oh, that was just a strange dream. And I thought, no, it wasn't really a dream. It was during that weird time. And I just couldn't let it go. It just kept picking at me. And so I thought, well, maybe this is my next spiritual path. But I'm very much, African in my spirituality. I have, my African medicine man, and I do all the African rituals and traditions. But here is this, Indian woman calling me. So I started, and as crazy as it sounds, I started trying to find her. So I had gone to an ashram as a young person in the Oakland area, Oakland, Emeryville area. And I thought, oh, maybe it's that guru from there, because I remembered it was a woman. So I went on the website, I looked around, I was like, no, it's not her. I continued searching. It got really crazy because then I started searching in India, trying to find where this person is, because by this time I'm starting to feel like I'm supposed to go to this lady. I'm supposed to find this lady. So it takes me some time. Somebody refers me to an ashram in southern India. I go on the website, I see the lady, and I go, oh my God, that was the woman that was in my dream. And I said, well, before, as a traditional African person, we consult the medicine man before we do anything, or medicine person. For me, it's a medicine man. Before we make any decisions, we have divinations that say, yes, this is good for you, or you're going to run into these obstacles, or no, that's not a good decision. So we don't do anything. I don't make any decisions in life without going this path. So I asked my husband, I said, I need you to talk to the medicine man, because I think I'm supposed to go to India and take the baby, my youngest son. And he says, India? He's also African. So he's like, India? You don't need, what are you talking about, India? And I'm going, I know it sounds nuts, but I just need you to ask for me. He comes back and he says, yes, well, they said that either you, at the top is India, or Tibet, or there's an African country that you could also go to. And I said, no, it's India, because that's what I dreamed about. So I sold our house. He travels a lot for work. So I sold our house. I sold all my stuff. I got one bag. I intended to have one bag for me and one bag for my son, but I'm still a little vain, Renee. So I needed an extra bag for like my hair stuff, like
And shoes.
and my, yeah, I just, and it's always so funny because I do all these spiritual paths, but the vanity is just still always with me. So anyway, one bag for me, one bag for my son, one bag for my stuff, and off we went. And when I got to the ashram, I'm telling the people, like, she was in my dream, and I need you to tell her that, because maybe she has a message for me, and I need to know. And so they do this thing, darshan, where you wait in the line for a very long time. And she's a big Satguru, right? She's very well known. I had never heard of her before, but she's very, very well known. I told the people, they took me to the front of the line. I got there and they translated. She said to me, I've been waiting for you. Welcome, my daughter. She kissed me on both cheeks. She kissed my son, fed him some chocolates, and told me to go on the stage behind her and meditate. And that's what I did. So we ended up living there for a year. So that's how I got there.
You lived there for a year with, how old was your son at this time?
At this time, I think he had just turned 7.
And your husband wasn't there?
No.
And he was fine with this arrangement.
He actually, he was disturbed a little bit by it, but it was the spiritual growth that's important. And he's very spiritual. So he recognizes that even if it sounds, ridiculous, and even if it's not in alignment with what we think we're doing in terms of our African stuff, it's important for you to do that spiritually. So then you need to go and do that. So, so we did. Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, for someone to be that open-minded about it, it's, my first thought when you said that was that it was a Hindu goddess was visiting you from, past life or whatever, that you had some kind of connection, and that was there to guide you to India or to some kind of teacher.
Yes. No, it was the actual human being.
Wow.
Amma is her name, Amma.
That's amazing. I mean, it's such a powerful experience to go through a darshan, because, the idea is that you're seeing the divine in this person, through this person. They're just a vehicle. They're just, really that's what they are, is just to be an empty vessel so that divinity can come through and communicate and connect with you.
Yes, yes, yes. So yeah, so that's how we got to India.
And what was your takeaway from it in terms of how did the Hindu experience add to your spiritual journey? And are there any practices that you do today as a result of that year that you spent there?
The first thing I realized was how much like my African tradition it was. It reminded me, there were a lot of, they do like puja, which, like a fire ritual first thing in the morning. And we do a lot of things like with boiling baths and fire and, different things like that. So my first thing was to be shocked at how closely it aligned with my African ways of being. Certainly the yoga is a big part of my life. So there was always that. The chanting is something that I still hold on to, because that was just such a powerful practice for me. But I think mostly it was a time for healing for me. I had been through, a lot of stuff in my life and a lot of trauma. And I think it was to take me out of the physical world and allow, like the typical physical world, allow me to serve, because everybody had their seva, the thing that they have to do to serve every day. Allow me to serve and really not have stress and distractions, and have the humility, right? I slept on the floor. I hand washed all of our clothes. There was no refrigerator. There was no air conditioning. It was it was a very austere lifestyle, very, very austere lifestyle, and requires just a lot of humility.
How did that impact your son?
You know, there's so many aspects to it for my son, but one of the big ones was, first of all, to really understand culture and human beings, right? Like to not have those judgments about people, understanding that culture drives behavior. So if somebody has a behavior that you don't understand, it's probably because you don't know their culture and why they do that. He had to become very resilient. It was difficult because he went to the local school that was there. So he would ride this bus in the morning, and, it's like 2,000 degrees outside, and there's too many kids on the bus for the amount of seats. So it's very difficult to be on that bus, and there's a lot of hazing, and there's a lot of things that happen. And he had to have the strength and the resilience to overcome that. He had to have the strength and the resilience to suddenly be eating food that was extremely spicy, right? And not the texture of anything that he was really used to. And I didn't allow him to eat American food. We ate the food that was served in the ashram. And so just his adaptability and his independence and his love for culture and respect for other humans, all of those things, I think, really were impactful for him.
Yeah, what a remarkable experience so early on in life, right? Like you said, the adaptability, the flexibility.
Yeah.
And kids are not generally great at food adaptation at such an early age. It's funny because I've lived in Africa a few times. We talked about that earlier before we started. And I was never really a fan of the South Indian food that I experienced in Africa, because when I went to India, I only really traveled in northern India, all the way up to Nepal and so on. So I really haven't explored southern India, but I experienced the food quite a bit when I lived in Africa, and I always gravitated to the northern food for some reason.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it can definitely be challenging. Yeah, it's different. The food is different, and it can definitely be, a challenge.
Yeah,
especially ashram food too, because
been there.
yeah.
Absolutely. So speaking of, you had the female guru in India, which is amazing. So on the path to where you are now, in addition to her, I imagine, and your mother and other family members, who most inspired you on this journey and why?
You mean like my lifelong journey, or just?
Yeah, like as you made your way to where you are in the work that you do today, there's like pivotal moments, right? There's like these watershed moments that are like bang, right? I'm sure the prison experience was one of them. But of those experiences, who jumps out as, maybe it's a mentor, or maybe it's not a mentor. Maybe it's something that someone said that totally changed your trajectory.
I will say it was one of the medicine men that I've had in my life who I consider my second father, and he really continued to groom me and raise me. I don't mean groom in an American, groom way, but really raise me and help me to understand how to be an African woman and how to be an indigenous African woman, how to be a wife, and all of the spiritual practices, and really, and oh gosh, I might cry, but just experiencing like pure and unconditional love. Like that is a person that just loved me. He passed away. So it's just, a person that loved me, and almost the love might be the most inspirational piece, because I don't feel like I had that love with that intensity in my life before.
Yeah. It was this person based in Africa or in the United States?
in Africa. Mm-hmm.
So when you consulted with him, how did you do that mostly?
It's funny because if I'm there, then, then we have our communication. But when I wasn't there, we would email. And so it was everybody, well, you've been in Africa before, so even if you live off the beaten path or in the bush where he lived, you have a cell phone. So like everybody has a cell phone. So I had to buy him a cell phone, a smartphone that could be used like a satellite phone, and he could have email on it, and we would email a lot back and forth. Yeah.
Yeah, I was really surprised actually, after I'd lived there in the 80s, right? This is all cell phone, and then went back in the 90s, and then, was part of the whole tech revolution.
Right.
I was just astonished to see how quickly you could get these cell phones everywhere.
Right.
With, of course, like the SIM cards that they had, right?
Yes.
Prepaid cards or whatever. But it was, amazing that even though there wasn't internet everywhere, everyone seemed to have a phone.
Yes, that's true. Yes. Because because it's just easier, I think, to have that than a landline, right? Like everyone couldn't have a landline before, but when the cell phone towers went up, then everybody could have that phone. Yeah.
It was amazing. So,
Mm-hmm.
so you wrote an article on teaching with humility in the Navajo Nation.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share some insights from that experience, and then also what inspired you to write it?
I love the Navajo people. I have a very special connection to the Navajo. My mother worked on the Navajo Nation for a while, and my oldest son lived with her for a while on the community when he was really struggling, going through a very hard time in his life. And he ended up graduating high school on Navajo Nation in Crown Point, New Mexico. So I have a special love for the Navajo because I feel like they supported my son in his healing process. Mm-hmm. So anytime I have an opportunity to serve in that community, I'm always looking for, how can I do something, give something, help heal something, facilitate something. And so one of the my regular jobs, so I have my business, and then I also manage a grant that goes into schools and teaches teachers how to work with students that have gone through trauma. And through that, I had this wonderful opportunity to go to Navajo Nation to do this training. So we were training about trauma and historical trauma. When I go on indigenous communities in North America, you can't talk about trauma without talking about historical trauma, because it's, I have a friend that says, he's very clever, Dr. Anthony Pico, and he says, historical trauma is the father of childhood adversity and the twin to addiction. So when we go on these communities, you have to be talking about historical trauma. So I went on the community, we did this amazing training. And I don't ever believe that I'm bringing new information. I always understand that I'm validating what the ancestors already knew. Yeah. And sometimes the people have forgotten, right, because of colonization and the stripping of cultural identity. So I never show up like, oh, here's this new information that I need to teach you. I say, well, let me tell you the science, and let me remind you maybe of what the ancestor says, or let me tell you the science, and now you tell me what the ancestors have said about this particular thing. And so I was doing this training, and there was a medicine man that was in the training. And, Navajo culture, people are very, well, in a lot of Native American cultures, people are quiet, right? They're listening, they're observing, they're trying to get who you are, get an understanding of who you are, and they may never say anything. So he was there, and I was waiting for him, hoping that he would say something. So I did, a 2-day training, and I was just dying for him to say something, but I could never put him on the spot. It's not appropriate culturally to do that. And so I brought up a topic where I was saying, well, here are some of the ways that you can neurologically regulate yourself. And, you know, Navajo, you're traditionally runners, and there's this thing called optic flow. And I went into the neurology about optic flow and running and this type of thing. And someone commented that, you know, it was their spiritual practice to run. And then he finally was ready to contribute. And he says, you know, his hand goes up and he's, you know, about to talk. And I'm like, everyone shut up. I get a chair.
Yeah.
Right. I get a chair. I sit at his knee and I'm like, yes, please, whatever you have to say. I've been waiting for 2 days. And he went into this beautiful story about healing and so forth and so on. And after I ended the training right then, because it was like, you know, the medicine person has spoken. I don't think he's old enough to be an elder, but he is certainly, you know, respected and carries medicine, right? And so there's nothing left for me to say. So he said his piece. I closed my mouth and said, training is over. Thank you so much for coming.
Wow, that's amazing. It was a way to honor him as, yes, maybe not an elder, but also someone who's respected in their tradition.
That's right.
So it was a very respectful thing to do, right? You're saying, hey, I honor you and your ways, and I'm here just as a facilitator. And I love what you said about as a reminder, because I think whether it's indigenous or any culture, because quite frankly, we're all indigenous, really. We're all originally indigenous in a way. We all have ancestors who knew the ways of nature and, you know, living on the land. All of us, right? Regardless of where we stem from, but we've forgotten, or we have not placed any emphasis on it or given it any credence or importance, and we've buried it.
Yes.
Right. And as you mentioned, colonization and, you know, everything that's gotten in the way. We've gotten so far away from our roots that we kind of, you know, as a society, it's like, oh, Western way and science is the only way.
Right.
Right. And kind of poo-pooed all the indigenous wisdom. And now look at what a mess we're in because of that.
Well, look at what a mess we're in. And then sometimes the science catches up to what, you know, the indigenous practices were. And that's what we see a lot in the field of trauma. The science is just now catching up to what the elders already knew, you know? So.
Yeah, incredible, right? Finally.
Right.
Finally, we're actually, you know, and we shouldn't need that. But, you know, the fact is that, you know, that's the way we've been conditioned and sadly wired. Yes. Right. Literally been wired as a global society that, you know, that way for so long. Though, you know, you say that too, but whenever I travel, you know, and running a travel magazine, I've been to a lot of places, 90 something countries now. And, you know, whenever I'm somewhere where they just understand and we're talking about some of the things that we spoke about earlier, having those visions, having those dreams, you know, maybe it is a goddess, right? Who's like visiting you. You know, for many, many traditions around the world, that's normal. Right. Right. They say, well, yeah, of course, my ancestors are right here around me.
Right.
You know,
right. Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that. So speaking of, that is actually a really great segue into the piece about African feminism and trauma that you wrote about. You write, in my tradition, relatives never die, and the ancestors are always with you. We spend a lot of time and resources revering relatives who have transitioned into the spirit world. And then later you wrote about something you called trauma informity, which you've mentioned earlier, actually, even though you said, I'm not even sure if it's a word, but it's a great description. And I think it says it well. You said that that's the word of the entire event that you had when you were visiting Kenya. Can you share some moments from that trip and your experiences there?
That I had no idea before I was going. I was asked to speak, do a keynote there, and then do a session on historical trauma. I had no idea really what I was walking into and what I was doing. But I got there and realized that there were 600 women from 55 different nations. Everything was translated into 4 languages. So people could talk about their trauma or talk about their thing in whatever is close to their native language as possible. And I think one of the most beautiful things that I experienced there was there were 2 women from, I think it's called the Saharan region. And it's not actually a country, it's like a region in Northern Africa. I think I think Morocco tries to claim it, and maybe Algeria also tries to claim it, but it's this region. And so there were these 2 women who had never left their country before, and they were in burqa. And this is a conference that was mostly Black Africans, right? So it's mostly Black African women. But there were, these 2 women that were more Arab facing African women. And they got up to the microphone and they started to tell their story. And they were crying and, it was very emotional. And I look around and there's just this sea of Black African women standing up. And there's this sound that we make, and you probably will recognize when I do it. The entire room is screaming in support, a sea of Black African women all screaming in support of these 2 Arab women. And they had never seen anything like it. They had not seen Black Africans before. They had not left their country before. They have been oppressed. They have gone through so much pain. Tears are coming down their face. The women are yelling, and everybody's engulfed them, grabbed them and hugged them and held them. And I mean, I get goosebumps when I talk about it, but
I'm getting goosebumps just
yes,
listening to it.
It was just profound. It was just beautiful and profound, and understanding how women, in that feminist movement get so burnt out because they're all going through trauma, right? They're all going through their own trauma, all the things they've gone through, and then fighting for all of these women. So they needed to understand trauma and understand how to heal some trauma and how to, what's happening with the neurobiology. And I had just never thought about it before, but it was like being cocooned, in a womb of healing for 10 days. I mean, it was just magnificent.
Yeah, because, it wasn't just 500 to 600 African women. It was Mother Gaia. She was there too, and that's something that it's only starting to become cool to talk about, right? Because if you talked about this before, that, Gaia had her own pulse, her own energy. She's alive. She's a force. She's an energy, people wouldn't even understand it. But now I think, since COVID, the understanding that she needed that time to restore herself, right? So that pulse of Gaia was also with all of those women on that day, I guarantee it. And, that collective, you talk about collective trauma. Well, that was the collective healing.
Absolutely.
That was happening through intention. So, wow, man, I would have loved to have been there to experience that. That must have been an amazing moment, right?
It was. Yeah, it certainly was. It really was.
Yeah, you didn't have to think about who you were, what you looked like, anything, right?
Right. I mean, I could wear all my African clothes. I could, I could be African. And, we talk about being trauma informed, or this, like I said, trauma informity, right? Where we believe that we just came up with all these new concepts and ideas of how to not re-traumatize people, but this is embedded in culture, right? This is embedded in many, many cultures. So just the planning of this trip, I didn't worry about a single thing. 4 people met me to pick me up at the airport. They had a snack for me. They had a hot cookie when I got here. They had water for me, like every minute detail was thought through. So all I had to do was show up. All I had to do was show up and be me. And I was taken care of, It was just, it was very beautiful, very healing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll bet it was. Speaking of, so we've talked a little bit about trauma generally, and then you brought in some of the science. So for people who are, I don't want to say new to trauma, because I don't think anyone's new to trauma, but they might be new to some of the language.
Right.
So when we talk about historical trauma, that's really collective trauma, right? Because historically we've all dealt with it, right? You look at Palestine and Israel. I mean, you can Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, right? There's some core places in the world where it's like screaming at you,
Right.
and other places where it's more hidden.
Mm-hmm.
So in your work in dealing with a lot of these societies, can you talk about the individual trauma, where it meets the collective trauma, and then what needs to happen for that healing to happen for the all?
Well, when we're part of a collective, like just to give an example, right? Anybody that's part of the collective known as human beings has been impacted by COVID-19, regardless of if you've had COVID yourself, if your family member had COVID or not. You're impacted because you're part of the collective known as human beings, right? You're impacted because you've seen someone else's suffering. You're impacted because society has changed, right? The way we shop has changed. Walmart, where I live, doesn't stay open 24 hours anymore, right? All of these things have happened. So we like to believe in modern culture, we like to believe that we exist as an individual in our own bubble, but we're all part of the ecosystem. We're all part of the nature. So any action I have, there's going to be a reaction, and it's going to impact me as well as impact you. So we can have individual trauma, but the individual trauma will always impact the collective. So really, we need to be healing trauma in community. When we're healing trauma, we really have to heal it in a communal way. It is not an individual linear process. It's a communal process that involves the entire collective. So those are really some of the things that need to happen. We have to start recognizing that what impacts me impacts you. I can't be free until you're also free. So, we have to come from that collective perspective. And how do we heal some of the issues in society, some of the societal issues? How do we heal some of the issues within the community? Because that's going to help the individual healing as well as the collective.
Yeah. Wow. So true, right? Like we just don't think about it in a collective way, and even among families, right? Because, we have it's not really a joke, but we kind of bring it up when in our communities, when we teach, we do spiritual courses and meditations and things around community.
Mm-hmm.
Some people will bring up, well, you don't know my sister, or you don't know my mother, or so there's always something around family. And so we have this joke that says, your family's here to teach you who you are not, right? Not who you are, right? So that you can rise above it. But there's a piece of belonging that is so strong for us, right? That's so tribal. So being cut out from the tribe or extricated in a way from our family because we go off and we do our own thing, right, is terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably even more terrifying than death, or it's up there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do we deal with it in our own small communities, like the immediate family, before we even branch out to the collective of, whatever it is, whether it's our culture, whether it's our race, whether it's, our sexual orientation? We have to start with how we've been conditioned from a place that for many of us feels toxic.
Yeah. And we're at a time now where we have more adults estranged from their parents and estranged from siblings than at any other time in history. So it's becoming so common, that estrangement is becoming so common. We are wired for connection. We're wired for interconnectedness. We're wired to be tribal. So one of the reasons I think that we start to have some of the trauma that we have is because we don't have the connections and we don't have the relationships, right? And if we really take it to the left just a little bit, the reason that we can destroy Mother Earth is the same and in alignment with how we've been able to exploit human beings, right? Because once we divorce ourselves of relationship, then we're able to be destructive in a way that we cannot be when we are interconnected and in relationship. So I think with the family situations, sometimes it might be that families are profoundly toxic, and maybe you really can't have those close relationships or have somebody in your life, but you have to, I think, at some point make peace with the way life is. You have to have harmony with how it is. You might have to be estranged from your mother, but as an African woman, your mother is your mother, right? You are your mother is you. So if you move through life hating your mother, right, you're hating yourself. You are the reincarnation of your mother, right? You have different features that, if you have your mother's nose, you can look on your face and see the physical reincarnation of an aspect of your mother. So you have to still be able to have that healing around it and have that love and compassion and empathy and understanding, even if you can't have the direct day-to-day interaction and relationships. And I think that starts the healing process. It's not one and of the same. The situations might be toxic, but that doesn't mean that our love stops. That doesn't mean that our respect or empathy or compassion stops. We still have love, empathy, compassion, connection, but maybe we just can't have it in the physical world,
Yeah, no, that's great. Not in the physical world. Yeah, I mean, you're kind of bringing up aspects of Buddhism there too, because, really it's about the inward journey. And regardless of the chaos that's happening around us, right? Call it trauma, call it chaos, call it disharmony, right? Where we're not connected, we've got to do that inward work and be okay with what is and give it forgiveness and healing and peace. And, even if, there's so many people, right, including Anthony and I, who don't have, super close relationships with everyone in our family, right? And so having that peace with it and just sending love, not being glued to the outcome. And I think that's a big thing that I think all of us as human beings, we want to see results. We want to see that, if we're working on our trauma and we're doing our work, how come I'm not seeing it in my brother or in my grandmother? Why is this not happening? Do I have to wait until they pass? And, I think that these are a lot of the questions that kind of come up,
right,
for people.
Right.
So I have two more questions and then we can close. I want to talk a little bit about race, because it's always an awkward subject for people who want to heal around it, right? If you're white or if you're privileged and not white, but, different orientation or whatever, you've been removed from that aspect of trauma in collective society. And that's a lot of people. So, people, I think on some level are almost afraid to become part of the conversation because it's awkward. You brought it up earlier. And as we've both traveled quite a bit, right? That kind of, whether it's racism or discrimination in any way, comes from, we don't understand another culture. We don't understand where it comes from. And it's having that patience, that empathy and that love, right? And that acceptance that we're all the same and that we're all connected, for us to be able to come together and realize that we're just energy. We're just energy beings having a physical experience. And when we can get to that place, then color isn't even part of the picture. But we're not at that place at this point. So I'd love for you just to share with people who really do want to make an impact and start conversations, but may feel awkward, or, you know, they don't know how, they don't want to offend, they're removed, right? They're so far removed. It's like, well, where do I start?
Yeah, and I think that people start with listening, right? I think that until you listen to my story, and until you have an understanding of who I am and where I've been and how I've been treated, or how my children have been treated, what my life experiences are, then you can continue to move in your world, not understanding what somebody else is going through. So I really think it starts with listening, having, you know, the willingness to hear, having the openness to see the full picture. An example I give, I work with police departments sometimes. And right, the media is constantly showing these images of police shooting Black people in the back, police shooting people of color in the back. I have to have enough open-mindedness, even though I raise Black sons. All my children are boys. I have a granddaughter, but all the children I've raised are sons, right? So Black sons raised in America during all of this time. I still have to be open-minded enough to recognize that, now, wait a minute, every time that that's happened, that is not every time an act of hate. It's not every time this is a racist person that wants to kill somebody. What is underneath that? What is the big picture? Oh, one of the big pictures is the fight or flight response. One of the pictures is, you know, I'm trained to use this weapon. I'm in this fight or flight response. I used the weapon before I even realized that I've used the weapon, right? I have to be open to that. I have to be open for the fact that the media impacts all of us. If I listen to the media, then I'm afraid all the time that my sons are going to be killed by a police officer because they're Black males. If the police officers listen to the media all the time, every time they encounter a Black person or person of color, bless you, they're going to have some level of fear, right? Because the media tells them these people are dangerous, these people are criminal, you have to be careful. So we have to be willing to listen. We have to be willing to open our eyes, see a big picture. And really, and I think, and sometimes, you know, people might criticize me or think something about me. I always think first about your highest self, right? I think first about your highest self. I have to assume that every time one of these incidents happen, it's not around hate and wanting to kill someone. I have to believe that. That's who I am as a human being. Let's look for what else is there, what else can happen. You know what I mean? So if I'm expressing to you that I have pain from this situation, or that my life has been painful, sit down and say, wow, I didn't know that that exists. I want to hear your story. You know, I'm here, I'm listening. I'm ready to hear you. And assume I'm telling you the truth. Assume that my feelings are valid, right? Validate my feelings as a human being. I think that's where we start.
Well, and to also know that we've all had conditioning, and, you know, the unfortunate thing about conditioning that is around divisiveness and not unity consciousness, right, is that there's fear. It's fear driven opposed to love driven.
Right.
So I think, you know, right or wrong, you know, when you're listening to someone and where they're coming from, if you don't understand it, you're like, really? You know, you have to know that they've been conditioned in this way that hasn't been serving the collective. Right. And I think that's the piece right now that we're seeing just kind of unravel before our eyes, which is painful for many. But I do feel that, you know, before a big storm of healing and love and change and disruption, right, and all of this stuff, you're going to have the chaos. And that's what we're seeing now.
Yeah.
So, that's very well said. That was beautifully said. And speaking of healing, a big part of it has to do with the rise of the feminine.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing that everywhere now. And I'd love to hear your thoughts as we are now seeing the rise of the feminine. And wow, right? What a moment to witness those two women from West Africa be able to speak up, probably for the first time in their lives, supported by all of these other amazing goddesses in the room, God, I just want to see more of that, right? As a white Western woman, I want to see that in Afghanistan and the Ukraine and Iran. I just want to see that proliferate throughout the planet. So what is the role now of men who are watching this happen? And some are coming from a place of fear and some are not, right? What can men do to support this rebalancing process right now as women are coming to the forefront more and more?
Well, we have a story in the Yoruba tradition, and essentially the story speaks to women having this power at one point and men taking this power away from women. And it's this imbalance that happened that caused us in Africa to be exposed to the slave trade and exposed to certain things that happen, and the dis-ease that we're seeing in many of our communities. It's because of this imbalance. So even when we had movements where we only uplift women, for us as African people in my tradition, we will say, no, you have to uplift both, because we must always have the balance of the feminine and the male and female. So the men have to continue to be supporting the women in this movement. The men have to also have a voice and say, when certain things just aren't okay. The men have to come forward and continue to uplift us and continue to support us as we have our voice. And we too continue to support men and uplift men as we have our voice. There has to be the balance. There has to be balance.
Yeah, and I think also in doing that too, it allows men not to go to that fear place, right? Which is, oh my God, we're going to lose control of whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, and that, it's interesting because that I think is what happens too when people of color are saying, hey, wait, this isn't okay now, right? We had this uprising of people of color saying this system that's in place is not okay. We're still getting damaged. And you have this reaction from some people that's really aggressive and negative and hostile. And you have this same reaction maybe to men who are fearful of women, because that's a natural response of the nervous system, right? If we have fear, we have a release of all those hormones in our system, the adrenaline, the noradrenaline, the cortisol, and all the others, that cocktail that comes into our system when we're in that fight or flight response. And when we have that cocktail of neurochemicals, we become aggressive and controlling and hostile, and we call names, and we can't access our empathy, and we can't be self-reflective. Those are all of the natural things that happen neurobiologically when the alarm in the cerebellum goes off that says danger, 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 because we're wired for survival.
Yeah.
So, in both of those situations, when there's fear, we're going to see those behaviors that become aggressive and difficult. So we have to make sure that there is safety. We have to create safety in all those spaces so that we don't have that fight or flight response that becomes aggressive or withdraws,
Yeah, it's limiting, right? I think, when we go to that place, we go to the most basic instincts of survival.
That's right.
At that point, how can you expand into the all and know that we live from abundance? Because really the message is we live from abundance. It's not about taking anything away from you.
Yes.
Right. So I think that's the same thing that men are feeling. And, you know, if we can come at it from a place of safety, like you said, and create safety, that you're safe. There's plenty for all of us, because when you win, I win.
Right. Right.
Right. That's the collective healing. So beautiful. Last thoughts, right? You know, what are you working on now? I know that you do some courses and some training and stuff like that. So do you want to tell people how they can stay in touch with you and connect with you and let them know what you're working on now?
Sure. So I have a 48-hour historical trauma specialist training that I put on twice a year. So there's the opportunity to do that. And the newest project, however, is the healing program. It looks at healing from a pan-Indigenous perspective. So it's wonderful for people who want to heal. It's wonderful for providers or practitioners that want to facilitate healing within their clients. And you can reach out to me at healhistoricaltrauma@gmail.com, and the website is healhistoricaltrauma.com.
Perfect. Well, we'll be putting up links to your work on the subsequent pages as well, so people can just click on it and go directly there and don't need to work so hard to find you.
Wonderful. Sounds good.
Yeah, what a remarkable conversation. And I've just loved everywhere that it took us today.
Me too. Me too. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you were patient and we got a chance to connect. So I deeply appreciate it. Thank you so much. I love your experience and your knowledge and being able to have that, you know, common language with each other. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. It has been such a pleasure.